Today we're going deep on European economics, and specifically, something you might not hear about every day, unit labor costs. We've got some fascinating clips from German economist Heiner Flassbeck, and he has a pretty strong argument that nothing explains inflation better than unit labor costs.
Oh, that's a big claim. But yeah, definitely worth a closer look. I mean, unit labor costs, it's not just about wages,
Yeah.
right? It's about wages and how they relate to productivity for each country.
So how does that tie into inflation then?
Well, think about it. If wages go up, but productivity stays the same, then the cost to make each unit goes up. And that can make prices rise everywhere.
Okay, I see. So it's not just like, oh, people are making more money, so things cost more. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And Flassbeck says, when you look at this over a long time, it actually predicts inflation better than other indicators.
Interesting. So it really challenges that simple idea that just raising wages equals automatic inflation.
Yeah. And Flassbeck, he uses this idea to really break down what happened in Europe, especially back in the early 2000s. He talks about how Germany had this policy. They were really keeping wage growth down. And that made German businesses super competitive, on the world market.
But didn't that have some, consequences for the rest of Europe?
Right, because Germany basically became this giant saver. They were exporting way more than they were importing, and that led to a big trade surplus.
So all that extra stuff Germany was selling, where did it all go?
Well, that's where the connection between European economies gets really interesting. Flassbeck argues that surplus from Germany, it's basically debt that other European countries built up because they were buying all those German goods. So one country wins and others kind of have to lose out.
Makes sense. And this is all happening while the European Central Bank, they had this goal of keeping inflation at 2%. France managed to keep their wage growth right around that target. But other countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, their wages went up more than that. So how did that difference in unit labor costs play into all the economic trouble that came later?
So Flassbeck's argument is that these different unit labor costs had this ripple effect. You had these Southern European countries, their labor costs were higher, so their stuff became relatively expensive. And they started losing their competitive edge within Europe.
So basically they got priced out even though it wasn't really their fault.
Exactly. And the consequences were rough. Flassbeck talks about how these countries had to do these really harsh austerity measures to try and get competitive again, like cutting wages way down. He uses Greece as an example. They had to cut wages by something like 30%, and that led to a lot of hardship.
Wow. It really shows how one country's policies can have these huge impacts on others, even if it doesn't seem like they're connected.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to compare this to what happens in the U.S., right? Because in the U.S., the government often takes on debt to balance out all the saving that corporations and, foreign sector are doing.
Huh. That seems kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't you want the government to avoid debt as much as possible?
Well, that's the typical thinking, right? But the U.S. consistently has higher growth and lower unemployment than Europe, so maybe a more flexible approach to government debt isn't such a bad thing.
So instead of thinking of debt as always being bad, maybe it can actually be a tool to help the economy grow.
Exactly. And this actually connects to Flassbeck's criticism of those really strict fiscal rules they have in Europe. Those rules that are all about keeping government debt low no matter what? He says those rules, especially with Germany's economic power, they really prevent countries like Italy and France from using government spending to boost their economies.
So they're stuck in a system that makes it harder for them to deal with economic problems.
Yeah, and this leads to another important point that Flassbeck brings up about saving. Okay, saving is usually seen as a good thing, right? But Flassbeck argues that if an entire economy saves too much, it can actually backfire.
How does that work?
Well, if everyone's focused on saving and not spending, then demand for goods and services goes down, and that can really slow down the economy.
Makes sense. It's like you need a balance, right?
Yeah.
Savings are important for the future, but you also need people spending money for the economy to work.
Exactly. And that's where government intervention through fiscal policy comes in. By changing spending and taxes, governments can influence how much demand there is in the economy, encouraging people to spend when it's needed and save when it makes sense.
Flassbeck also gets into this controversial idea of currency manipulation. He suggests that Germany, by keeping its currency relatively weak, it gave their exporters an unfair advantage on the global market.
Right. That's been a big debate among economists for a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah. Some say a weaker currency helps boost exports and grow the economy, but others say it can create trade imbalances and make things less stable.
It's complicated, There's no easy answer, and it really highlights how important international cooperation is when it comes to managing exchange rates and making sure global trade is fair.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all these different policies, they all feed into this bigger issue of global economic imbalances that Flassbeck talks about. He's basically saying that when some countries have these huge surpluses while others have big deficits, it's just not sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, and that brings up this scary possibility of another global financial crisis. I mean, if these imbalances just keep growing, it seems like something's got to give eventually, right?
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. Flassbeck doesn't pretend to have a simple answer to such a complicated problem. But he really stresses that we need to completely rethink how the global economy works. He wants a system that focuses on growth that's fair and sustainable for everyone, not just a system where some countries win and others lose. So it's a call for a global economy that's more just and balanced, one that works for everyone, not just a few countries at the expense of others. But how do we get from talking about the problem to actually making things better?
Mm.
What can we do to address these imbalances and stop another crisis from happening?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Flassbeck doesn't give us a simple roadmap or anything. He says we need a bunch of different things happening at once. Like countries with these big trade surpluses, Germany is a good example, they need policies that boost demand inside their own country.
Like what kinds of policies?
Things like raising wages, investing in social programs. That way they wouldn't have to rely so much on exports, and it would help even things out globally.
So instead of focusing on selling stuff to other countries, they focus on making things better for their own people.
Yeah, exactly. And on the other side, you have those countries with the trade deficits. They've got to focus on making their own industries stronger and more competitive.
And what does that look like?
Investing in education, infrastructure, things like that. Encouraging innovation, making it easier for businesses to grow.
So it's not just about changing who buys what. It's about making the whole economy stronger in the long run.
Right on. And Flassbeck really stresses this too. We need countries to work together to fix these global imbalances. He's talking about stronger global institutions that can promote fair trade and stop currency manipulation. Having some kind of framework where countries can coordinate their economic policies.
So instead of every country just doing whatever's best for them in the short term, we start thinking about the bigger picture and the long-term stability of the whole system.
Exactly. We have to remember we're all connected in this global economy. Flassbeck might be talking specifically about Europe, but his ideas really help us understand the challenges facing the whole world economy.
Definitely. That focus on unit labor cost is a major factor in inflation. It's a real challenge to conventional thinking. It makes you think about the relationship between wages, productivity, and prices in a whole new way.
Absolutely. And it shows us that governments have a huge role to play in how the economy works.
Right, both within their own country and on the global stage. Fiscal policy, trade deals, currency stuff. Governments have so many tools to influence the economy.
Yeah. And this brings us to a really important point that's kind of at the heart of everything Flassbeck's saying. Economics isn't this neutral science, right? It's totally bound up with politics, with who has power, and in the end, it's about how people are doing.
It's about people's lives.
Exactly. If we want to create policies that help everyone and make the economy work better, we have to understand all these different forces that are connected to economics.
Well, I think this deep dive into Flassbeck's work has been really eye-opening. It makes you question what you think you know about economics and consider some new ways of doing things.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that economic policies aren't just abstract ideas, they have a real impact on people's lives.
For sure. As we move forward in this complex economic world, we've got to keep having these conversations, listening to different perspectives, and trying to find solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Couldn't agree more.